I never imagined my own child would treat me like a bank account with legs. Jason and Brianna shoved a $390,000 loan in front of me, demanding I risk my house and savings. When I refused, their smiles vanished, replaced by threats and venom. It was betrayal, pure and raw. But they didn't know I'd been keeping notes, and what came next turned their world upside down. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. It was early evening, and the house sat quiet around me in a way that felt heavier than usual. I sank into my recliner in the living room, the oak floors beneath my feet creaking as if they remembered all the years I spent crawling over them with a hammer and nails. I had put every plank in myself when money was tight and time was long, sweating through weekends so the place would feel like a real home. On the mantel above the fireplace rested our wedding photo. Helen's smile caught in that perfect moment of light, and for a second I let myself whisper to her memory. The Kansas City Royals were on the television, volume muted, flickering images of the game throwing shadows across the old plumber's level I had set on the shelf years ago. That level had helped me keep pipes straight for 30 years. I used to joke that it kept my life straight, too. Tonight, though, nothing felt straight anymore. A box of receipts sat at my feet, spilling across the rug like confessions I had kept hidden too long. Each paper was a story of sacrifice, a measure of love I thought would carry weight when the time came. There was the tuition check I wrote, 4 years in a row, $58,000 in all, so Jason could walk across that college stage with no debt on his back. I had worked overtime weekends, hands cracked and raw from turning wrenches, so he could wear a gown and throw his cap into the air without the weight of student loans dragging him down. He had hugged me then, said he would never forget. I had believed him. Next to that lay the receipt from the used Camry, $24,000 cash I wired after he totaled the old Civic. He called me, shaking, ashamed, promising he would pay me back. Of course, he never did. I told myself it was fine. He needed the car for work, for life, for moving forward. I wanted to believe I was helping him build, not teaching him to lean. My checkbook carried scars from 1,000 such cuts, one $1,800 for dental crowns, $16,500 toward the wedding he and Brianna insisted had to be one day only perfect. Even the $3,200 I forked over so they wouldn't be stranded in Hawaii when the hotel bill ran higher than their credit card could stretch. I remember Helen's pecan pie recipe card tucked at the bottom of the box, stained with flower fingerprints, her handwriting curling soft on the edges. She used to tell me that love measured in dollars was still love, as long as you gave it freely. I wonder what she would say now, watching her son keep tally on what I still owed. The walls of this ranch house hold more than receipts. Zillow says it's worth around $520,000 these days, but to me it's worth far more. I paid off the mortgage years ago, each extra payment carved out of double shifts and cold sandwiches eaten in my truck. The garage out back is more workshop than storage, shelves lined with tools I kept in perfect order. Out in the yard, the grass grows thick and green because I nursed it season after season, planting seed, pulling weeds, trimming edges. Retirement accounts rest quietly in the bank, too, stacks I built from overtime, the kind of security I thought would let me breathe easy in these years. This house was meant to be my fortress, not a target. On the wall hangs a photo of Jason at 10 years old, standing on a milk crate in my workshop, tongue poking out as he twisted a socket wrench around a pipe. I had snapped the picture because I was so proud. He had looked up at me that day and said, "Anything worth having is worth working for, Dad." That line used to fill me with joy. Tonight it burned like acid because the man who once said it was gone, replaced by someone who thought my labor meant his shortcut. The signs had crept in slowly, and I admit I ignored them at first. The leased BMW he drove up in on Thanksgiving, shiny and loud against the cracked driveway. The luxury dinners he bragged about, pictures of steak plates bigger than the billfolds I carried through most of my life. Brianna's spa weekends, each one necessary for her stress while their credit card balances climbed. Together, they pulled in $76,000 a year, a decent living if you respect it. But their lifestyle told a different story, one closer to $85,000 or $90,000, always stretching further than the paycheck, always spending tomorrow's money before today was earned. It started small, almost reasonable. Just $500 till my bonus, Dad. Then, the car payment's killing us, can you spot $800? After that, it was medical gaps, insurance shortfalls, the kind of excuses that pulled at the heart because you wanted to believe. Each time I wrote the check, I told myself it was temporary, that they would straighten up, that Jason was still the boy who once valued work over handouts. But slowly, each favor became expectation, each bailout less gratitude and more demand. The night they came with the mortgage was the night the line broke. We sat in the kitchen, the table scarred with years of dinners and homework and coffee cups. Jason slid the stack of papers across like a dealer sliding cards, his voice cold and final. It's time to help us. Brianna barely looked up from her phone, eyes glowing with pictures of granite counters and walk-in closets. Grandparents invest in the future, she said, as if my life savings were a starter kit for her fantasies. I ran the math in my head, numbers snapping into place like bolts. A $390,000 mortgage, monthly payments close to $3,900, their debt-to-income already stretched so thin you could see daylight through it. Every red flag I ever learned in a lifetime of balancing checkbooks and paying bills was waving high. I set the papers back down and said no. The air turned brittle. Brianna's crocodile tears spilled across the laminate, her chair scraping hard as she stood. Jason's jaw clenched like stone. They left with a door slam that rattled the windows. I sat staring at the empty chair, coffee cooling in my cup, realizing the boy I raised was gone. The smear campaign began almost instantly. Texts pinged my phone. We'll lose $22,000 earnest money because you're selfish. Jar, 48 hours or we're ruined. Then the fake pregnancy scare, Kayla's message reading, I'm late, stress makes me sick, why are you doing this to your grandchild? Calls started flooding in, Elaine from church, Frank from work, even Mrs. Caldwell from across the street, each one repeating the story they heard, a twisted version where I was the miserly old man hoarding money while my poor children suffered. I could feel the walls of reputation closing in, the whispers already circling the neighborhood. That was when I started a log. Dates, times, verbatim quotes, screenshots captured and filed. If they wanted to paint me as a villain, I would hold the brush of truth. My notebook filled line by line with their accusations, their manipulations, their lies dressed as pleas. The pain was sharp, but somewhere inside it began to shift. I stood in the living room again that night, the lamp throwing soft light over Helen's photo. I whispered into the stillness, Honey, I'm not the villain they're writing. Saying it aloud steadied me. From the corner of memory came a click, a reminder. Minnesota's one-party consent law, something I had read years ago. Suddenly, I realized I could record every conversation legally. My estate folder lay waiting in the desk drawer, Sarah Whitman's card still clipped inside from when we drew up the will. The tools of defense were already in my hands, waiting for me to use them. I pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer and wrote a single word across the top. Evidence. The letters looked strong under the lamp. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders eased. I wasn't helpless. I had been a plumber all my life, and plumbers know one thing better than anyone else. The only way to stop a leak is to trace it back to its source and shut off the supply. Jason and Brianna thought they could flood me with guilt, but I had just found the valve. The phone rang again, buzzing across the table. Their names lit the screen, but I didn't flinch this time. I reached for the pen instead, steady and deliberate, knowing that whatever came next, I was ready to meet it head on. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. Morning came with a clean edge, and my coffee tasted like a promise I could keep. I opened the yellow legal pad and read the word I had written in thick block letters the night before. Evidence. I let the letters sit there and told myself to move the way a good plumber moves when he is tracing a leak. No panic. Follow the line, find the valve, and turn it with a steady hand. I started with the bank. First National had a switchboard, but I asked for Dana Brooks by name because Jason had mentioned her more than once. When she answered, her voice carried that careful tone people use when the next sentence might matter. I said I was being asked to co-sign a large mortgage and needed to know what I would be attaching my retirement to. She pulled up the file. Cards at about $52,000, she said, plus loans. Debt to income around 41% before any mortgage. A note about late payments. She paused, then added that the picture did not look stable. I thanked her for her time. She reminded me that any co-signer becomes the payer if things go wrong. I said I understood. I did. I understood it all the way down. I thanked her and set the phone beside my mug. The house was quiet enough to hear the clock. I opened my laptop and pulled up Jason's page, then Brianna's. I moved slowly, not to savor anything, but to make sure I saw everything. The Vegas weekend was still there, the champagne tower, the view from a suite. The Miami girls' trip was still there, too, first-class boarding photos and white robe selfies. The gaming rig photo glowed like a showroom, 3 monitors and a new tower that cost between $3,500 and $4,000 if you know what you're looking at. I took screenshots of all of it. I labeled folders in plain English so I could find them again even if I was tired. Lifestyle versus claims. Pressure texts. Third-party outreach. It felt simple and honest to name things for what they were. By mid-morning, I called my attorney, Sarah Whitman. I told her what Dana said, what I had saved, and what I had already logged. She said my instincts were right. Keep replies plain and short. Record any conversation I am part of. Our state allows it. Expect words like promissory estoppel and oral promise. Expect the elderly confusion story. Do not rise to it. Let paper do the talking. I ate a sandwich over the sink and then made the call I had been putting off. I rang my son with the recorder running. I asked why he believed I owed him my savings. He did not stumble. Families pass wealth down. He had always counted on his inheritance. It made no sense for me to sit on cash while he and Brianna were starting their life. I kept my voice even. I said, I am alive. I said there were no promises. He snapped that my charitable giving showed I could afford it. I noted the date, the time, the words, and the tone. I did not try to change his mind. I was not calling for that anymore. I was calling for the record. A minute later, a text from Brianna popped up like a spark. You are stealing our future. I stared at the line until it cooled. Then I took a screenshot, tagged it with motive, and filed it. I opened the list I had made for callbacks and worked it like a punch list. Ben, a buddy from Jason's college days, said Jason had borrowed $3,000 from him last fall, promising to pay it back after a bonus that never came. The apartment manager, Tracy, said rent had been late more than once and confirmed 2 months behind earlier in the year. I did not fill in the blanks for her. She had said enough. The facts were a clean line. Anyone could follow them. By afternoon, I needed to put my hands on something that did not glow. I drove to the post office with a small box for an old friend. The air smelled like paper and dust. While I waited, I heard 2 voices behind me in that stage whisper people use when they want to be heard without owning the words. That's the stingy dad. The sentence landed like a small stone. My palms went damp. My throat tightened. The clerk called me forward. I paid and slid the box across the counter, then walked out without looking back because I knew if I turned, I would say something I did not need to say. Sitting in the cab before I drove off, I let the sting pass and turned it into fuel. If they were staging a courtroom out here in public, then I would bring the real courtroom to them. I whispered it once so I could hear how it sounded. Not a threat. A plan. Facts, records, witnesses, the kind of truth that does not blink under bright lights. I put the truck in gear and headed home. In the parking lot, I texted Sarah. Expect a demand letter soon. 3 dots, then her reply. We will be ready. It felt like a hand on my shoulder. I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio low. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked like a fortress again, not because it had changed, but because I remembered what it stood for. That evening, I laid every printout across the kitchen table and checked for smudges. I backed up the files again. I put the screenshots in plastic sleeves. I made a clean index with timestamps and sent it to Sarah. On a fresh page, I wrote the names of people who had seen or heard enough to matter. Elaine had heard Brianna play the wounded daughter-in-law. Frank had taken the call where Jason said I was ruining his life. Pete Larson at the hardware store had served them when they bragged about the BMW. Nora at the diner had listened to Brianna's tears and then seen the photos. Pastor Hart had heard a prayer request that did not match the spending. Mrs. Nguyen had already started to put posts next to purchases and watched the story shift. I felt the table become a small map with points I could trace with my finger. Before bed, I took care of my side of the fence. I logged into my retirement accounts and turned on multi-factor sign-in. I set alerts on my home title so any change would ping me. I froze my credit at all 3 bureaus and wrote the pins in my notebook. I checked beneficiary lines and made sure the names matched the intent. I told myself I was not being dramatic. I was being a grown man who knows a loose valve can flood a room. Morning came quietly. I called Sarah to walk through the index. She told me it was clean and to keep the recorder on and my sentences short. No family meeting without counsel. I promised. Then I made small calls that matter when storms are building. I asked my bank to flag my checking so no large transfer could go out without my voice. I asked my insurer to send fresh copies of every policy. I checked the safe for the deed and the will and the power of attorney and stacked them with the binder that was now taking up a corner of the table. In the afternoon, I drove to the library because the printer there is fast and steady. I made 2 binders with tabs and an index in the front. I used clear sleeves so the pages would not wear. I placed 1 binder in my trunk under a moving blanket. Redundancy is not fear. It is wisdom learned from broken pipes. On the way out, I ran into Mrs. Nguyen. She looked tired in the way people do when they have believed a lie and then seen its seams. She said she had compared Brianna's posts with the vacation pictures, and the timing was something she could not ignore. I thanked her for the kindness of saying it out loud. Sometimes kindness is just telling the truth without a raised voice. That evening, Jason called and left a long message about the seller, the deadline, and the weight of my refusal. He used the word father like a lever and the word family like a key. After the beep, he called again. I did not pick up. A text from Brianna landed a few minutes later. She said they had found a cheaper house in a neighborhood no one would want, and that if something awful happened, it would be on me. I watched the bubbles fade, then I filed the message with the others. The phone went face down, and the room was quiet again. The next day, I firmed up the parts that other people could hold. Tracy said she would write a letter if asked, dates only, balances only. Ben said he would send a note about the $3,000. At the diner, Nora told me she felt used by Brianna's tears and planned to set the record straight if anyone asked. Pastor Hart said the same. He had seen this kind of pressure before. He said the truth has a way of showing itself when you give it room. I drove home with coffee in a paper cup and the sense that a tide had turned a few degrees in my favor. By midweek, the file was not a file. It was a case. 18 recorded calls, each labeled. 43 messages, each with a context line. A list of witnesses who could say what they saw and what they heard. I stood at the table and felt the shift. The hurt was still there, but it was not driving anymore. Confidence was, not the loud kind, the kind that lets your hands stay steady even when someone tries to shake you. They think I am weak, I said, but they are about to learn how wrong they are. Saying it out loud made it true in my bones. On Friday, a certified envelope landed in my mailbox with green sticker. The return address said Cole and Finch LLP, signed by Andrew Cole. Inside was what Sarah told me to expect: a demand to resolve financial obligations, written in a tone that tried to sound friendly while reaching for my pocket. It spoke of opportunities to avoid litigation. It hinted at promises I never spoke and duties I never took on. I placed the letter beside my binder and wrote the date across the top in neat numbers, because dates matter more than speeches when you are dealing with paper. The yard needed water, and I needed air, so I walked the lawn while the sprinkler ticked its steady rhythm. The light went from gold to the kind of soft blue that makes you want to sit on the step and let your bones rest. Back in the kitchen, I washed one plate and one mug and set them on the rack. I checked the door and turned the deadbolt. Then I sat and looked at what I had built: 2 drives in plastic cases, 1 binder with tabs, a legal pad with a clean index, and a plan. A letter that looked important, and would be, but not for the reason they hoped. That night, the phone stayed still. Maybe they were drafting a new post. Maybe they were asking friends what to try next. Maybe they believed that a law firm's letterhead was a hammer big enough to break me. I slept with the window cracked and dreamed of clear water running through straight pipes. In the morning, I packed the binder into a canvas bag along with a pen, a bottle of water, and a copy of my deed. I drove to Sarah's office and parked under a tree. Her lobby smelled like coffee and paper. We sat at the conference table, and I set the binder and the letter between us. I told her about the post office whisper, about Dana's numbers and Tracy's record and Ben's note, and the messages that had turned friends into witnesses. She read fast, then slow. She asked clean questions and drew a neat outline on a yellow pad. "We will respond in writing," she said. "We will challenge every claim that pretends a promise where none exists. If they file, we ask for documents. Discovery has a bright light. Keep recording. Keep your words plain. Patience is not passivity." I nodded. I understood. When I left her office, the sidewalk felt level. People carried coffee and talked about their own lives. Mine was heading toward a courthouse, but I did not feel dread. I felt purpose. I drove home by the long route that goes past the river and the ball fields. I rolled the windows down and let the wind lift the corner of the canvas bag. Back at the house, I set the bag on the table and looked around like a man taking inventory. The oak floor held. The wedding photo caught the light. The old level sat on the shelf with its bubble centered, and it settled me in a way nothing else could. I checked my phone and saw a final message from Brianna. It linked to a listing and came with a sentence that tried to bruise. I filed it without a reply. Then I walked to the garage and stood in the doorway. The smell of oil and wood made the ground feel right. My tools were in their places, handles smooth from years of use. I wiped the bench and put the pencil back in its groove. Inside, I filled a glass with water and drank it slowly enough to taste it. When the mail truck rattled by later that day, I did not rise. I had enough paper to last a season. What I needed was rest and a steady plan. I pulled the legal pad close and wrote one last line across the bottom. "They do not know I already hold the thing that will change everything." I put the cap on my pen and waited for the ink to dry. Then I placed the certified letter from Cole and Finch beside the stack so I could see the whole picture at once. Folder, drives, binder, letter, plan, breathe in, breathe out. I turned off the kitchen light and let the room keep its quiet. Down the hall, the mantel kept a small glow. Helen's smile was kind and sure. I told her what I tell myself when a hard job is ready for the next step. We are fine. We are steady. We are ready. Then I went to bed with the binder by the door and my phone on the nightstand, and I slept. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. The morning the story went public, I was trimming the boxwood by the walk, thinking about straight lines. The clippers clicked in my hands. Steady. Then my phone lit up on the porch rail. Brianna's post was waiting. Jason photographed at an angle that hollowed his cheeks and shadowed his eyes, a hand pressed to his forehead like a stage prop. The caption shouted that their father sat on 6 figures while they lost our home. Under it, my town, my age, a hint about my church. She used the word hoard twice. She called me selfish once. Shares rolled like a slot machine. Old neighbors weighed in. Strangers did too. If a rumor could roar, this one did. I read every line and then read it again, the way you check a fitting for a whisper of water. The yard didn't care. A dove called from the fence. I heard Helen the way I hear her when I need a steadier hand. Count, Walt. 1, 2, 3. Don't argue with shadows. Bring a light. I set the phone down, finished the hedge, swept the walk, and hosed the broom. If they wanted a crowd, they could have it. I would want a record. I had barely poured water when a car door thumped. Caroline came up the steps with printouts clenched hard enough to wrinkle the paper. She didn't sit. She asked if I had promised and backed out, her voice tight with embarrassment, borrowed from 1,000 comments. She waved the stack, Jason's haggard photo, a caption heavy with grievance, neighbors who were sure they knew what kind of man I had become. I let her pace while the ice melted in my glass, then asked her to breathe. I told her what I knew and what I had written down. $52,000 in credit cards before a mortgage. A BMW lease at $1,050 a month. 2 months behind on rent. Vacations bought with plastic. Most seniors settle, said out loud. The text calling my savings, our future. Fuh! I set the binder on the porch table and let her turn pages. She read the transcript. She stared at the screenshots lined up by date. The highlighter in her hand stopped moving. I didn't know, she said, softer. You didn't, I said. You were told a story. She touched my arm the way big sisters do when words run out. What do you do now? She asked. I don't fight in the street, I said. I carry it into the room where the floor is level. That evening, a certified envelope thudded into my mailbox, and an email twin chimed a minute later. Andrew Cole of Cole and Finch wrote with soft words wrapped around a hard point. He hoped to resolve matters amicably before formal proceedings. He suggested a meeting to avoid unnecessary cost and proposed that I help Jason and Brianna secure a modest home while protecting my retirement. He used phrases like family harmony the way a salesman uses an air freshener. I forwarded it to Sarah with one line. You read? Her reply came fast and plain. Will attend. Say little. Let them talk. Bring the binder. The steadiness in her punctuation calmed me more than the words. Andrew's conference room was glass and chrome, a view of the city, and a bowl of polished stones pretending to be calm. He spoke in warm tones about holidays and carved turkeys and fathers who say generous things that children might hear as commitments. He said courts are blunt instruments and neighbors are kinder. He said a small gesture could keep a young family safe. He never used the word please. He suggested helping them close on a starter place and assured us he could craft language that wouldn't expose me. Sarah asked for writing, any writing, where I promised $390,000. He smiled as if we had missed the point. Families don't always draft contracts, he said. Of course, Sarah answered, which is why courts insist on proof. Pibby, he suggested coffee to reset the tone. Sarah thanked him and said our calendars were full. After lunch, my phone buzzed. Jason asked to meet at Coffee Corner, just the two of us, to talk like father and son. 15 minutes, I said, in public. When I parked, his text moved the meeting to Riverside Park, the old side, with the benches near the path where I taught him to ride. I let the change sit. I turned on the recorder and walked across the grass. The park was half sun, half shade. Jason sat hunched, elbows on knees, eyes rimmed red. He tried a smile. It landed crooked. He said he was drowning, that bills were bricks on his chest, that he couldn't catch a full breath. I didn't reach out to pat his shoulder. I said I was listening. Then I set my phone between us, screen dark, microphone alive, because Minnesota lets you record your own conversations and because men who think they're directing the scene often forget where the camera is. He talked. Not in circles, not in blame, just the kind of straight line that sounds like relief. $52,000 in cards. A BMW at $1,050 because a guy in tech should look the part. Vacations on credit because pictures pay you back. He said they never thought I would fight in court. Most seniors settle, a phrase he had picked up like a tip from a bartender. He said if I would co-sign, they could refinance in a year, maybe less, and get you off the hook. He said inheritance as if it belonged in the present tense. The bench felt steady under me. I said thank you, the only words I trusted in that moment. When he walked away, I saved the file, sent it to the cloud, emailed it to myself, and copied it onto the little flash drive that rides my key ring. Redundancy is not paranoia. Redundancy is a life spent fixing leaks. 2 days later, a process server knocked. The complaint was thick enough to bend. At the top, it named Jason Hayes and Brianna Hayes as plaintiffs and me as the defendant. The number was right there, $390,000 plus costs and attorney fees. The claims were familiar from Sarah's warnings, oral promises, promissory estoppel, reliance built on the father's repeated assurances. One paragraph floated cognitive decline to excuse the lack of writing. I sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and marked a small check next to each sentence that would die under daylight. Then I carried the pages to Sarah's office the way you carry a heavy thing to the only bench you trust. The hearing date landed on a sky so clear it looked scrubbed. I wore the suit from Jason's graduation and drove early so I could sit in the hall and let my pulse find its pace. The courtroom was dark wood and straight lines. The seal on the wall watched everything. Judge Marion Clark took the bench with a crisp manner that told the room there would be no theatrics. Andrew opened with myths dressed as memories. He spoke of holiday toasts and kitchen table promises, of a son who made plans because his father said generous things. He gestured toward Brianna when he said home, and toward Jason when he said future. He didn't hold up paper. He didn't read a sentence I had written. His story asked the judge to believe a fog. Sarah stood and opened the tab labeled Recordings. She did not swell. She pressed play. Jason's voice filled the wood and the air. Inheritance as expectation. Most seniors settle. $52,000 on cards. A BMW at $1,050. Vacations on credit because pictures pay back. He said the quiet parts out loud. The room stayed still while his own words cleared the fog. Sarah followed the audio with paper. Debt statements, the apartment ledger, screenshots side by side, Vegas and Miami next to posts about grocery money. Witness notes from people pulled into the pressure web. She spoke in simple sentences. Then she added the line that mattered most. There is no writing, Your Honor, no contract, no commitment, only pressure, spending, and expectation. Judge Clark leaned forward with a pen between her fingers and asked one question that cut through everything. Where is the written commitment for $390,000? She let the number sit heavily in the room. Andrew opened his mouth and closed it again. He said many family agreements are verbal. The judge said she had not asked about many. She had asked about this one. Silence did what speeches could not. In that quiet, I felt my pulse even out, the way it does when a level finally stops rolling and the bubble finds center. Her ruling followed in steady, measured sentences that felt like a carpenter setting a level across a long run. The complaint was dismissed with prejudice, no promise to enforce, no contract to stretch, no equity to conjure. She looked over the exhibits and said the record showed a pattern of spending and a campaign of pressure, not reliance on any commitment. Then she spoke to dollars. She awarded my legal $29,800 fees and punitive damages of $14,700, $44,500 in all. She issued a restraining order, no contact, direct or through third parties, no approaching my home, no further public defamation about this dispute. Last, she referred the matter to the district attorney for a review of potential perjury. Her pen moved, paused, and moved again. The order was signed. Brianna folded inward as if someone had cut a wire. Real tears, not the glossy kind, fell fast. Jason stared at the floor like a man who had lost the map he trusted. Andrew bent to them and hissed words I couldn't hear but could read. Stop talking. In the hall, a reporter asked how I felt. I kept my answer short. Family should be love, not leverage. She wrote it down and thanked me. Outside the doors, the sun felt like clean linen on a line. My phone buzzed with messages flipping back. Nora from the diner texted first, apology wrapped in coffee. Pete from the hardware store said, "Whatever you need." Mrs. Nguyen wrote that she had learned more in 1 hour of documents than in a month of posts. Elaine sent a heart and nothing else. I felt the tight band around my chest loosen and drop. I didn't pump a fist or take a lap. Sarah handed me a copy of the order, the seal still faintly warm. She said the checks would come slowly, the restraining order would hold, and the referral would take the time it takes. We shook hands at the curb. I closed the binder, and the click sounded like a toolbox after a repair. On the drive home, I rolled past Coffee Corner and then the turnoff to Riverside Park. The benches were empty. The swings moved a little without anyone in them. At the bridge, the river slid around rocks without asking permission. At the kitchen table, I set the order where Jason had once laid the mortgage and let the edges line up with the wood grain. The phone buzzed with a number I didn't know. I let it ring and go quiet. Later, a voicemail declared there would be an appeal, that this wasn't over. I deleted it. The order on my table said otherwise. Out back, the grass needed cutting, so I pulled the starter cord and walked lines into the lawn while the engine settled into its hum. Over the noise, I spoke a sentence low enough for only me and maybe Helen to hear. They thought I was weak. Now they see the cost of that mistake. The mower left a stripe, and then another, until the yard looked like a field ready for a small-town game. A dog barked once beyond the fence, and then chose peace. Birds kept at their work. Life has a way of moving toward normal once a storm has spent itself. The sun slipped and cooled the air. I rinsed the mower deck, wiped the handle, and put it back in its place. The click of the latch was the sound I wanted for this whole story, a latch closing, not a door slammed in anger. Before bed, I opened the binder and slid a fresh page behind the last tab. I wrote one line in my own hand, so I'd see it before any noise tried to rise again. Truth doesn't shout. It stands. I closed the binder and turned off the kitchen lamp and let the house go dark the way a house ought to when the work is done and the tools are back where they belong. Morning brought Nora's message. Coffee's hot. Come by. I drove because kindness deserves a yes. She set the mug down and rested her fingers on the rim like she could pass steadiness through porcelain. She said she had read every word of the order and felt a weight lift that she didn't know she'd been carrying. I told her I felt the same. Behind me, a spoon tapped a glass. Someone laughed. The room sounded like a town finding its balance again. On my way out, I looked down the block. Pete stood in the hardware window and lifted a hand. I lifted mine. In the truck, I sat with both hands on the wheel and let the quiet sit. The binder rode shotgun like a friend who had done his share and didn't need to talk about it. I drove slowly because sometimes you let a place show you its good side after it's shown you its hard one. Rooflines cut the blue clean. Lawns looked newly combed. People walked dogs and nodded the way people do when they're ready to get back to the business of being neighbors. Back home, a message from Caroline blinked on my phone. She had taken the index and copies of the exhibits to 2 loudmouths from last week. One apologized out loud. One looked down and kicked a shoe. She asked if I needed milk. I told her no, but I thanked her. The act mattered more than the errand. By noon, the hedges were square again. I locked the front door and set the binder on the hall table where a square of window light lands in the afternoon. I didn't need to carry it from room to room anymore. The next steps belonged to the system that had just worked. The fee award would wind its way through. The restraining order would hum along in the background like a sump pump you forget about until a storm comes. The referral would walk at the slow pace of the office. My work was to live the life I built and paid for and to tend the small things that keep a life decent. I ate a simple sandwich and washed the plate. I checked the air in the tires of the truck. I tightened 2 screws on a cabinet hinge that had been complaining for weeks. Inside, I sat at the table and wrote a last line for the day on the pad where I keep small truths. People will say, "This is over." It isn't. It's settled. There's a difference. Over is loud and brittle. Settled is quiet and strong. A settled thing stays put. It doesn't rattle when the wind tries the latch. I set the pen down and turned the calendar page to the next square. The coming days looked ordinary in the best way. Trash pickup, the dentist, lunch with a friend, a talk at the senior center about scams and boundaries. Regular life, earned the hard way. Late light pooled on the oak floor I installed myself, and the grain looked like a shallow river I could wade if the boards were water. I stood there and let the light slide a few inches, the way it does when you finally have time to watch it. I told Helen what I always tell her when a hard job has been done right. We're fine. We're steady. We're ready. Then I walked down the hall with the windows open to the soft air and slept the kind of sleep that comes when a man has put his name to the truth and the truth has answered back. Quiet and sure. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. The order sat on my kitchen table like a stone that had finally found the bottom. Dismissed with prejudice. Fees and punitive damages tallied in black ink. A restraining order with boundaries clear enough to read from across the room. The seal shone faintly where the clerk pressed it. I ran a finger along the edge, not to savor anything, just to feel the shape of something that had been earned the hard way. Then I took out my phone and called Sarah. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the smile in her voice. She said she had already filed for the fee award and set calendar reminders for every compliance date the court would expect. She said she would draft a memo for me on how to enforce the restraining order if a line got nudged or crossed. I thanked her and told her I was going to spend the afternoon doing the quiet work no one sees. She said that was the best kind. I started with the perimeter, the way I do when a storm is promised. The safe opened with that small click I can feel in my teeth. I pulled the living trust and laid it next to the order. I read it slowly. I marked a margin where something needed updating. Helen's careful handwriting noted a date from years ago. I could hear her teasing me for taking so long. I called the bank and asked for a trust officer, then called Sarah's office and set a time for an amendment. I made a clean list of beneficiaries and cleaned it twice, not because of fear, but because clarity deserves that kind of care. I logged into the title monitoring service and triple-checked that any attempted change to the deed would bark at me and bark at Sarah. I opened my password manager and walked through the vault item by item, changing what needed changing, shredding what needed shredding, writing nothing on sticky notes because a house like mine carries too many stories to risk one left loose on a desk. By mid-afternoon, the binder that had ridden shotgun through the hard days lived on a lower shelf. I didn't need it on the table anymore. I stood at the sink and watched water fill a glass, the surface rising clean and steady. I drank it slowly. Outside, the lawn lay even, the stripes still faint from the last cut, the boxwood square where I had left it. My shoulders went down without me telling them to. I sat in my chair facing the mantel, and the light caught our wedding photo so that Helen looked like she always did when I was nervous and pretending not to be. I told her the same line I've been whispering since the hearing. We're fine. We're steady. We're ready. Saying it out loud always helps. The town turned slowly, then all at once. The next morning, I walked into the diner and found Nora already pouring coffee into a mug with my name in thick blue marker. She slid it across to me with both hands, like a hot apology might spill if she moved too fast. She didn't make a speech. Her eyes said what needed saying, Then she said 3 words in a voice that shook a little. I was wrong. I told her we had all been fed a story too neat to be true. She said she had read the order online. She said the part about recordings made her sit down at her kitchen table and stare at the wall for 5 minutes. I told her I had done that too. She topped off the cup and told me the pie was on the house. I paid for the pie anyway and left a tip that would buy the waitress lunch. At the hardware store, Pete Larson came around the counter like he had been waiting with a joke he didn't know how to tell. He didn't joke. He stuck out his hand and shook mine long enough to pass something steady from his palm to mine. He pointed at the coffee pot on the shelf behind him and said, with a grin that reached his eyes, that coffee was on him for life. I told him if he kept that up, he'd have to hire a second pot. He said he would risk it. It wasn't the promise that mattered. It was the lift in his voice, the way it sounded when a man sees his neighbor as himself again, not as a rumor. On Sunday, Pastor Hart shook my hand and didn't let go. He said the senior group had been asking questions in the hallway about gifts and pressure, and the word family stretched until it thinned out and snapped. He asked if I would be willing to speak, not as a victim, but as a neighbor who had walked through a storm with a dry legal pad and a plain voice. I told him I would and that I would keep it simple. He said simple is what holds. News about Jason and Brianna did not arrive in a tidy package. It came the way wind comes through a screen, odd moments and scraps. I learned that the earnest money, $22,000, which they had waved like a threat when they thought I would blink, was gone for good. The house was never going to be theirs. A week later, I watched a tow truck creep down their street like a guilty idea. The driver was gentle, but the beeping still echoed. The BMW left its driveway tilted and backward, like a lesson hauled away. Their Facebook pages went dark, then blank, like curtains yanked shut. Someone said Jason's employer had seen the referral to the district attorney and decided they did not want their company name mentioned in the same breath as perjury. The whispers said his hours were cut, then the job went thin and snapped. I did not feel a thrill when I heard it. I felt what a man feels when cause and effect do what they are supposed to do. Not joy, not revenge, just a kind of cool fairness that lets everyone sleep better. Sarah forwarded an email the same afternoon, a copy of a letter from the bar to Andrew Cole. The language was formal, but even I could hear the point through the legal phrases: sanction for filing a frivolous action, a note about the duty to investigate facts rather than shape them to suit a client's story. Sarah attached a 3-line message to me that said only this: system working. I wrote back 2 words: thank you. Peace does not arrive like a parade. It comes in small tasks met with both hands. I turned the soil in the garden and slid tomato seedlings into place, rose straight enough to make my old level proud. The compost smelled like a promise kept. I set a trellis for beans. I pressed my thumb into the dirt to test the moisture. I watered slowly so nothing washed out. The evening light made the leaves shine with that new green that only lasts a week. I sat on the back step and felt my bones put themselves down, not because they were tired, but because they knew where they belonged. I looked toward the kitchen window and said a quiet line to the woman whose hand was still on the back of my neck when I think too hard. I kept our house safe. Saying it out loud mattered. It tied the knot. I let myself choose small joys and choose them on purpose. Morning walks when the air is thin and the birds sound like work being done without complaints. A ball game with the sound up just enough to hear the crack of a bat and the murmur of a crowd. An oil can on the hinge had been complaining for months. A faucet at Mrs. Chen's that had been leaking a teaspoon a day. I fixed it for free and wrote nothing down because not everything needs a paper trail. I pulled a lawn chair to the shade and read an old mystery I had never finished. And when the hero made a good choice, I smiled like a man who knows how rare that can be. The restraining order held the line where lines needed holding. One afternoon, I saw Jason across the courthouse steps while I was dropping off a document for Sarah's clerk. He took a step forward as if muscle memory wanted to close the space. I put up a hand with the palm out, not angry, not taunting, just an honest reminder of the order the judge had written and he had heard. He stopped. He looked at the signs that say, "No smoking" and "No weapons," and the one that might as well say, "No foolishness," then turned back toward the sidewalk. He kept his head down, and for the first time since this started, I felt pity try the edge of my resolve. I let it try. Then I turned and walked inside to do my errand, because pity that erases a boundary is not kindness. It is something else. Brianna wrote me one email that pushed the idea of amends without touching it. It read like something drafted for the crowd more than the heart. Lines about misunderstandings and the pace of social media and the anxiety of modern life. She never said what she had said. She never named what she had done. She said she hoped we could move forward. I sent it to Sarah and watched it slide into her archive with a soft digital sigh. I did not hit reply, not anger, not bitterness, just the steady decision to let silence say what needed saying. In my journal that night, I wrote one sentence in a hand steadier than it had been in months. No more rescuing bad choices. I underlined it once and closed the book. I did the rest of the house the way a good custodian does a school after the students have gone home. I tightened the strike plate on the back door. I replaced a smoke detector battery and wrote the date on a small strip of masking tape because you always think you'll remember, and you never do. I organized the boxes in the garage so that the old Christmas light sat where my back would not have to bend so far. I cleaned the gutters before the maple buds let go and filled them again. It was nothing anyone would notice, but it was everything that kept a life from tilting. On a Thursday, I stood in front of a group of seniors at the church fellowship hall with a whiteboard I did not use much. I told them to write down dates and times and phrases, not to be dramatic, but because paper remembers what fear forgets. I told them that kindness without a boundary is not kindness. It is a leak. I told them that there is no shame in saying no when the math and the gut say no. I watched heads nod and pens scratch and a few eyes fill in a way that told me their kitchens had held their own hard conversations. After, a woman in a red sweater folded my hand into both of hers and said she had paid for her grandson's rehab twice and his truck 3 times, and that hearing the sentence about leaks made her feel like air was getting into a room that had been shut too long. I told her she could love him and still lock the valve. At the diner, Nora started setting aside a table near the window when she saw me come in. Folks who had glared from corners now lifted hands and said my name like it had always been mine. I didn't bask in it. I took it as what it was, a town remembering itself. At the hardware store, Pete asked me about tomato cages and whether he should spring for the heavy ones. I told him the cheaper ones bend when the storm comes. Buy the good ones once. He laughed and reached for the good ones. A letter came for me from the senior center, not a bill, not a warning, just a simple invitation printed on thick paper. Would I be willing to lead a monthly clinic called Scams and Boundaries? They didn't mean just scams from men who call in the night about warranties. They meant the family kind, the close kind, the kind that makes you feel like the bad guy when you are the only one acting like a grown-up. I set the letter on the table and let the idea warm up before I said yes. I wrote the word neighbor in the margin. That word felt better than victim. I never liked the other word anyway. It sticks to your shirt. The fee check came in 2 parts. One arrived by mail with a cover letter that felt like it had been copied and pasted more times than the clerk could count. The other was hand-delivered by a courier who brightened when I gave him a bottle of water and told him to sit on the step for a minute in the shade. I deposited both and sent Sarah a photo of the receipt. She wrote back with a period that looked satisfied. The punitive damages were cleared after that. I didn't buy a thing. I didn't paint a room. I let the numbers sit in their lines like bricks in a wall. They were not a prize. They were part of a new weight that held. Some days I felt the old ache try my ribs, the part where a father asks himself if he could have done one thing differently 20 years ago that would have tipped the boy another way. I let that ache visit, then I sent it down the walk. I cannot go back and sand one board in a floor I already installed. I can keep the floor swept and oiled, and I can take my shoes off when they're muddy. That is enough. On those days, I would open the photo album and look at Jason on the milk crate with the wrench, tongue out in concentration, and I would talk to him in my head the way you talk to someone who lives far away now. Son, I kept a roof over your head. You will keep a roof over your own. This is how it works. On the first Saturday of the next month, I stood in my yard with a hose on a trickle, giving the tomatoes just enough. A robin landed near my boot and cocked his head as if he had a question of his own. I said to no one and to everyone, I don't need their apology. I have my life. The words didn't sound hard. They sounded light, like a shirt swinging dry on a line. I wiped my hands on a rag and went inside to make a sandwich with a thick slice of tomato I had to buy for now, but not for long. I ate at the counter and watched the afternoon slide across the oak floor, the grain catching the light like water in a shallow creek. Toward evening, Caroline called to tell me she had taken a couple of the worst rumor folks to coffee and put the order in front of them. She said one of them cried a little. She said the other got quiet and said he was sorry. I thanked her for carrying paper where it was needed. She asked if I wanted company for supper. I told her I was fine and that I had leftover stew and a ball game. She laughed and told me to call if the stew burned. After I hung up, I took the living trust from the safe one more time and went over the update. I penciled in a note to speak with Sarah about a scholarship in Helen's name at the trade school, something small and tidy for kids who still want to work with their hands. The thought felt like a window I could open. I sat down with my journal before bed. I wrote slowly so the lines would have weight. I wrote that dignity matters more than blood when blood behaves like water. I wrote that truth does not have to brag. I wrote that love needs a fence. I underlined the fence because I am a man who knows what happens when you don't keep one mended. Then I closed the book and went to the living room. I turned the Royals on and let the sound stay low. I watched until the innings rolled over into the kind of late where the house asks for dark. I clicked the set off and stood in the quiet and said the line to Helen. I know by heart now. We're fine. We're steady. We're ready. When I slept, I dreamed simply. A clean pipe, no drip. A straight board, no warp. A tomato vine is heavy with fruit. No one chased me down a hallway. No one shoved paper under my nose. I woke with a lightness that felt earned, not borrowed. In the morning, I ironed a shirt and wrote the title for the first senior center clinic in block letters on a note card. Scams and boundaries, and under it, 3 words that had carried me this far. Dates, documents, dignity. I put the card in my pocket and picked up my keys. The day outside smelled like cut grass and coffee. I locked the door behind me and walked to the truck. The house stood quiet and sure, the way a good house does when it knows the man who lives there remembers what matters and what does not. I started the engine and smiled at the small sound it made. Then I drove toward a new month with the window down and the sun on my arm, open to the kind of change that feels like peace rather than punishment, the kind of change you choose. The mornings feel different now, not louder, not brighter, but steadier, like the air itself has decided to ease off my shoulders. I wake without the weight pressing down, without that quick punch of dread that used to meet me before my feet even touched the floor. I sit on the porch with my first cup of coffee, Cardinals radio humming low, the oak throwing its shadow across the lawn, and I let myself breathe. It isn't victory I taste in the coffee. It's peace. That kind of peace you only get after you've stood your ground, after you've drawn a line in the sand and watched the tide try and fail to wash it away. The house feels safe again, not because of the locks or the papers in the safe, but because I know no one is circling it like a vulture anymore. I tidied up my trust, set up alerts, and filed Sarah's memos exactly where they belonged. The binders sit heavy on the shelf, but they're no longer on the table. I garden now without looking over my shoulder. Tomato vines climb like they know they're welcome. Beans snap crisp in my hand. I kneel in the dirt, wipe sweat on my sleeve, and think of Helen telling me to thin the seedlings more than I want to. I tell her out loud sometimes, "I kept it steady, honey." The words carry. They settle in the soil. The town, too, has shifted. At the diner, Nora still tops off my coffee without asking, but now she adds a slice of peach pie and doesn't let me pay for it. At the hardware store, Pete laughs about the sanction letter Andrew Cole received and shakes his head, saying he knew from the start the man was too slick for his own shoes. At church, Pastor Hart has me talking once a month about scams and boundaries, about how love without limits turns into leverage. I tell the truth plainly. Dates, receipts, voice recordings. I don't dress it up. Paper remembers what fear forgets, I say, and I see heads nod. Some of them smile through tears because they know the weight of a son or daughter's demand and the guilt that comes when you try to say no. Jason and Brianna are out of the house they dreamed of. The $22,000 in earnest money is gone, the BMW hauled away. Someone said they rent a cramped apartment near her parents now, driving a second-hand sedan with more miles than pride. Jason's job dissolved piece by piece after the perjury referral, hours cut, then a dismissal that came in a plain envelope. I don't gloat. It's not triumph I feel when I hear these things. It's the slow balance of cause and effect. Choices tally up, bills come due. One letter did arrive, a careful apology with Jason's name at the bottom. Sarah filed it away with the rest, said boundaries mean not every knock needs answering. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. In my journal, I wrote one line. I don't need their apology. I have my life. I underlined life, closed the book, and slept better that night than I had in months. Every so often, life throws me a soft surprise. One afternoon, Mrs. Nguyen came by with a peach cobbler, still warm, sugar crust cracked just enough to show the fruit underneath. We sat at my table and traded stories about grown kids, about forgiveness that doesn't always mean forgetting. She said sometimes love looks like distance. I smiled, not because I had won, but because I had told the truth and stood in it long enough to feel the ground under my feet again. From all of this, lessons settle the way dust settles after a storm, gently but everywhere. For parents like me, the lesson is this. Sacrifice does not mean servitude. You can pay tuition, you can buy the car, you can cover the wedding, but you still have the right to draw a line and keep your dignity. Love is not proven by draining yourself dry. For children, the lesson is harder but sharper. Gratitude is not optional. If you build your future on entitlement, it will crack under you. Family is not a bank, and parents are not lifeboats forever. And for all of us, the truth about this modern world is that temptation runs fast, entitlement louder, but character is still the currency that spends in the end. Without it, every shiny thing loses its light. My days now fill with smaller rhythms. I teach a teenager from the neighborhood how to sweat copper joints, let him handle the torch, and see the solder flow silver along the seam. I tell him mistakes make better lessons than lectures. I volunteer at the senior center, fixing water heaters and faucets for folks on fixed incomes. I walk mornings by the park, listen to birds instead of gossip, and nod to neighbors who used to avoid my eye. Slowly, the community has come back, not because I won in court, but because I stood firm in truth. I end most evenings in the garden, hands in soil, the sprinkler ticking like a soft metronome, sun slanting low over the roof. I watch the light catch on the oak floor inside, through the window, the same boards I laid with my own hands decades ago. They have held. I think about the letter Jason sent and the silence I chose in return, and I feel no regret. Some doors stay closed. Some lines stay drawn. That's not cruelty. That's respect. For myself, for the truth, for the life I still have left to live. And so I whisper the words I know by heart, words I want anyone listening to remember. Family isn't who reaches for your wallet. It's who respects your no. Character is the one asset nobody can take unless you give it away. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.